Cool. Welcome to the Data Friday. My name is Michael Olschimke. I'm the CEO of Scalefree. We have the session here every Friday, 11 o'clock Central European Standard Time, like German time. And yeah, to allow you, the audience, to ask questions about Data Vault, apparently, but also any data-driven question is allowed, anything about cloud computing, MP systems, and so on. You can use the chat here to ask live questions. You can use the Q&A in this client. You can essentially raise your hand to raise your voice if you want, or use a form, which I'll show you the link to essentially after this today's session. And if you receive multiple questions, I would cherry pick. Yeah, and then if there would be no question at all, we had this time in the last summer or the last summer break, I would essentially talk about the cluster here, my little side project in this is my personal basement here, actually in our personal house. So yes, I have a cluster in the house, but I don't have time. Thank God you have questions. You're asking so many questions, and that's why I don't have time to play on the cluster here. That's the situation, to be honest, which is good. So yeah, let's talk about one question that we received. Let me just share my screen in 1 second. So this is apparently not a Data Vault question, actually. That's yeah, a couple of reasons why I took it. The person who sent this in essentially created a nice diagram, right? So cool, and not a Data Vault question. So yeah, a new thing here. So this is about fact measures. So they got some dimensions here, and for this question, there's multiple questions. So we might see this multiple times, this slide in one of the next weeks. Yeah, so we see some fact entity here and a couple of dimensions. Those dimensions for the first two questions are not that important. It's more important about those measure values here for the next questions, or for the first questions here. So we see there's some decimal valued measure values, but also measure values with a null value, and there might be integer based measure values. So far, so good. I mean, nothing special from a fact entity, all good. And then we got a data dimension and some references to dimensions, which we will discuss later. So the first question is all about the measure values here. First of all, there's apparently 6 measure values, float or decimal values in the data set, and typically for each row, some of them are null. So only a few of them, in this case, maybe half of them have values, and the other half roughly has null values. So would it make sense to unpivot the data and somehow encode this using a dimension for the type of measure or something, so like a measure type dimension or something, and then only have 2 columns per fact, essentially. And then you could yeah, aggregate it, whatever. So to some extent, yes and no. I would do this if I have a lot of measure values, different measure values, and if I really can't, if I can't pivotize the data, like if I don't know how many measure values I have. I've seen these systems as well, right? So if you can't clearly define the measure values and the number of measure values, then that would be a good idea. Yeah, and then maybe you could that's one thing. So then yes, what about cases when you have let's say overloaded facts, when half of the attributes have values, the other half has no values, or the other way around, right? So it's never the case that let's say question would be, is there a fact where all the 6 measure values would be completed, would provide values? That would be for me the other extreme case. For example, in Data Vault, you might see this in links, and that is a sign for overloading a link, and that essentially shows us that the link has or meets different purposes here. I'm not saying I would refactor it. I would just review it. What's the cause for this, and so on. So that's the thing. So it might lead to splitting the link into 2, for example. Might. I'm not saying it would be right, but I would just review this essentially with some more time during a review when we perform a Data Vault review with the client. Here, my thinking is going to be different. So yes, even if this extreme case is the case, that's on your fact. So you overload the facts. Okay. Does it affect your granularities? So does the fact still make sense to and it's not from a data modeling perspective, it's more for a data user perspective, because they will consume, as who's consuming the facts, and does it make sense to them what you did? And even if you overload the facts to some extent, if that's what the user wants, to be honest, if that's what the user, I'm not saying I wouldn't deliver them crap, or I wouldn't deliver them just because you come to me and say, you know what, that's what I want. So just deliver me this nonsense, right? I would talk to you. I would try to discuss you out of this. But here I wouldn't really discuss. So if for me, that would be okay. And it's really also about performance. So the unpivoting the data, you have to join this dimension table and then filter the facts, for example, while when you just leave it in one fact entity in columns, you have less records. You don't have to apply where condition. The where condition is not that expensive. But if you move this on a column-based storage, you just aggregate the data. The only thing I would do is essentially I would remove the null values and replace them by some measure like 0, right? So if that makes sense, that's the other thing, right? But because I want to prepare the aggregations, I don't want to filter out the null values. I just want to query on those records, on those facts by aggregating, and that's it. And that's why I want to deal with these null values to prepare to prepare the aggregation. So most probably turns into a 0 value. So yeah, I would just keep it. Most probably if it's just 6 measure values, some of them are null. And there's an upper limit for how many measure values you want to have. Just keep it in fact entities, turn this into column-based storage, replace the null by most probably a 0 value. I don't know the exact requirements, right? And then prepare the aggregation, because that should be the fastest option. There's something on the chat. Let me just check. Okay. Yes, sorry, I come back to that. So there's something going on in the chat here. So we also have measure values which are based on integers. Does it make sense to separate them into their own fact entity? No. Just, I mean, the data type shouldn't define where you put that you split the measure values into a different fact entity. So I would keep that together essentially. Yeah, that shouldn't be the driver. Yeah, that's a relatively short answer, to be honest. So I just wonder. No, the same game. I would prepare the measure values again. If there's null values in there, make sure you can aggregate on them, right? But that's it. I would just keep everything in the fact entity. The problem is in this case, if you separate those into 2 different fact entities, many users, if I would be a user, I might have to rejoin those fact entities again, because I might want to use both measure values in one query, essentially my dashboard. And that's a problem, because these fact entities, when you're on large volumes of data, and this comes from a financial project, a financial data set from asset management. So I'm not sure what the value, I don't believe it's large volume of data, like 100 millions of rows. I know it's not. So it's not a big data scenario. So this might work technically, but on high volumes, it wouldn't work, because you would move this on a column-based storage. That's when the join performance is not good, right? If you have 2 equally sized fact entities or non-histographic links or bridge tables, and you want to join them, that's a problem. Impala, other engines have problems with that, just because of the design of the column-based storage. And that's why I would keep that together, so I can just aggregate the values, present them, done. If I want to do that with 2 fact entities here, I have to join these fact entities. That's the problem. So that's why I wouldn't do it. I would keep it together. All right, on the chat. So that's it for those 2 questions. We might see this again later, right? So let me just stop my sharing here. So there's a couple of questions here on the chat. Let me just go for this here. Let me start with one here before I do before I talk about some marketing stuff here, Kenneth. From Parvis here, is CDC inherently supported by the Hadoop platform when a file is ingested? So what we do is essentially this. On a Hadoop cluster, when we like a data lake, or we like to use Hadoop for a data lake, and for us, from a pure data perspective, from a data warehousing perspective, the data lake is just a huge persistent staging area, to be honest. So because that's how we consume it, right? So the data is on the lake, and we want to consume it for the raw data vault. That's a major driver. Sure, there's another use case. When you have semi-structured or unstructured data, we leave it on the lake and integrate it with the raw data vault. But still, and then your PSA on the data lake turns also into a data warehouse where we store the unstructured, semi-structured data, essentially. So that's number one. But when you talk about CDC data ingestion, then for me, it's really the PSA part of the data lake. And what I would do is this. just offload the data as it arrives. What people try often is when you get full loads, let's say, they want to essentially reduce it to a delta lake, for example, and so on. What I would do is this: if you want to have a delta-driven data lake, the source must define the delta. So if the source provides you a delta, you keep it as is. So whatever the source delivers, you just offload this into the data lake. If the source system delivers full load, so be it. I know these projects where they turn this into a more delta-driven data lake, but they spend a lot of time on that. And for me, the question is always, what is cheaper? The storage, where you just dump the data in and add more hard disks in the worst case, just buy more disks, as bad as it sounds. Not very environmental friendly here, I agree, but just add more disks. And compared to your development time, because you are not alone working on this data lake and optimizing it storage-wise, there's a team working on this, right? There's not just one person, there's a couple of people working on this, and you cost money as well, believe it or not, and somebody has to pay your bills as well. And I would just compare the costs. What's cheaper? If you can show me a business case now where you're cheaper than storage, you got a problem personally, that's one thing, but I would go for not buying disks, but doing that, right? So that's number one. And these solutions, which I see often, they don't scale. So it's not that you build a solution that works just every time. No, it has to be done load by load, apparently, where they analyze the data, deploy something, and so on. So while if you just decide to just dump it, well, we built just one script for a source and dump all the data from all the tables. Done. So that scales. So that's what I know for sure. And yeah, I have to add more disks, and even at Scalefree, we consume more storage. So, but this it's cheap. So why should I bother? That's number one. So sorry, Babs, I'm going a bit longer here. So your source is delivering deltas. So that's a cool thing. That's the cool thing about CDC. That's why we prefer CDC delivery into a data warehouse, especially in a data lake. In a data lake. Now, what I would do is I would just dump it. So the CDC data comes from somewhere, from some CDC tool, maybe in the cloud or on premise, whatever, and you just offload the data. These CDC packages, you just offload them as they arrive. Sure, you select the right storage format. You don't want to store this as a CSV file, maybe. We did this sometimes as well when the CDC tool is able to dump directly into the data lake, but then CDC, like Amazon Data Migration Service, is a CDC tool in the end that can offload your data into S3, but it's CSV files, uncompressed. Yeah, not nice. What depends on your data volume, sure, but we had cases where we just dumped the data because on relatively low volume. If it's more volume, then you push this into Kinesis and compress it there. Maybe turn the storage format into something more efficient, Avro files, Parquet files, and dump it as snappy compressed Avro Parquet file, essentially. But that's it. That's for the Hadoop, for the HDFS part. And then for the raw data vault, if you turn this into a more, let's say you stay on Hadoop, you stay on Hive, for example. And we did these projects on Cloudera, for example, building the whole enterprise data warehouse on the Cloudera stack. Works. What I'm not doing is, so first of all, I would like to consume this whole CDC package with all these intermediate changes into my raw data vault. Because from an information delivery perspective later on, I don't know which delta from the CDC package the end user wants to report on. Give you an example. You're telling me you would like to report on the last message of the day. Makes sense business-wise, right? But what means last? Like last from the last CDC package, the last record, the last record, right? Or is it the last record when you close the office, essentially at 6 p.m. in the night? Well, what means that? Because what time zone, for example, right? So last is, you can interpret last, and that's a problem. So which record they want, we don't know. Not when we ingest the data into the data lake or into the raw data vault. So I keep everything. And then for information delivery, I prepare a PRT table that points to those individual records I want to have, I want to report on, essentially. That's my index to the subset of the records of the massive data volume that you're now collecting, right? So yes, it's supported, and we do this all the time. But it's essentially because we just capture the CDC package as a relation or as a file first, as a Paket file, ABO file in a data lake, and then turn this into a satellite essentially in a data model. So, and then last week something happened, and today there's actually the internal release party for that. And some of you received that on a newsletter. There is essentially a Data Vault 2.0 package for DBT. Yes, the thing is, more and more we have customers where we work with different automation tools, in Warescape, VaultSpeed, and CS, for example, and DBT. DBT came out of demand from the market, so we looked at it, liked it as well, started working with it. And there's also packages that support Data Vault to some extent. But then we also realized that we modify this all the time. And many customers, we also realized when we talk on conferences, many people start taking these open source packages and modify them to the better. And then we looked into our project and realized that that we essentially heavily modified and more modified these packages, the more we understood them essentially. And then realizing that we essentially so heavily modified them that you couldn't even distinguish them anymore from the original project. So we said, if that's the case, if we modify them anyway, why don't we just publish our own? And the Data Vault for DBT package, as officially called, essentially is the code from projects, from our internal project, but also from customer projects, where the customer agreed to work together on these packages, where we essentially were able to publish this. So yeah, it's what we use actually at clients. On the other hand, it's on everything, because we said let's publish everything where we don't need to discuss that much, where everybody agrees that this is the pattern how we would use to, let's say, define a hub or load a hub or standard link and so on. As soon as we start so I did a lot of review, right? So I looked at the code, and the developers had to explain me what they're doing and why they're loading it this way and so on. And we had a lot of these reviews and fixed everything. And I'm not saying it's completely error-free, right? So there might be issues where you don't agree. So send comments directly on GitHub. So just raise issues, right, on GitHub. And that's why we call this a pre-release at the moment, because we want to get some feedback from the community, and then we go for version 1 and then continue adding more and more features. Now, whenever we discuss internally, given these scenarios, let's say you receive data via CDC versus full loads and so on, real time and so on. Once we start discussing like this, that this should have an impact on the pattern, then there was a high chance. I mean, you have two options. You either remove the pattern for now, maybe it will come later, or you extend the pattern in a way that supports all these circumstances. But that we didn't do. So typically we removed it. And those patterns where we discussed a lot, where it depends, right? How you would build this depends on the loading mechanism and so on. Typically for the rolling load on a loading mechanism. If that's the case, you can expect these more complex patterns with conditions and so on. You can expect them, but in the future, essentially. So yeah, in projects, we typically have more patterns, but they're not ready yet for publication, because we really spent a lot of time on quality checking before we publish anything here. For those who are interested, I should have showed it, because now you see my face, who cares? 1 second, sorry for that. GitHub, Scalefree. Let me share my screen here. So there's so when you go for github.com/scalefree.com, you find a Scalefree for DBT package. There's more stuff coming actually, but these are the public ones, okay? I mean, there's a lot of public repositories. Let me just go back, sorry. You see a lot of public repositories here. Yeah. Because we use open source, we love open source, just like everybody else. And we use it internally and with clients. And that's why we made the decision back then that if we have code that we built, which is based on open source, and which is not a, let's say, company secret in any way, right? Which we're consulting firms, obviously. We decide to publish everything that's an internal work, what's called, when I tell you what to do, right? So I told my team, whatever is based on open source, you can publish. I mean, we don't have secrets, just publish the heck out of it. Just put everything online. Sure, we have our internal repositories as well, so I'm not going to this tab here, but we'll find a good amount of stuff. And Data vault for DBT is essentially, because it is based on open source. So we said, you know what? Let's publish it. That's what we do. I don't even have to discuss that. I mean, they came up with this and said, we want to publish this. Can you take a look at it? So yeah, it's all there. It's a data vault for DBT package, and it supports already, hub-sync satellites, staging area defined, where we do hashing, pre-joining of business keys, introduce ghost records. It supports non-historized links in satellites, multi-data satellites, virtualized end dating in satellites. I mean, these are practices we do in projects. That's how we customize these packages that we use. Normally, if it's DBT or WAScape or vault speed, we typically modify the templates that come with the tool. And pit tables, essentially, snapshot control tables, that's the features at the moment. I mean, you can expect, again, more, but on the other templates, we couldn't agree on how you would apply them to, I mean, I'm an engineer, so I would like to have a simple pattern, and I'm only adding more complexity if there's a need. And apparently, for the added complexity, there's a need, and that's why we didn't publish it yet. The complexity will come, but in the right quality. Yeah, so lots of features, check it out. And yeah, it gives you one more option. I mean, you know, other tools, other packages, it gives you options, go for what you think is good. That's the one we use at clients and internally. So, and people are waiting for it. So it's interesting that you're asking, because everybody's asking about the package at the moment. And it's Apache 2.0 license, right? So use it as you wish. All good. All right, it's open source. We love it, and that's it. Cool. That's it. Thanks for the marketing question here. All right. So yeah, good questions. Thanks for the question in the chat. Really loved it. I hope to, yeah, one more thing. If you have questions like this, I should have told you. Check out this URL, right? https://sfr.ee/dbfriday. And yeah, check out the form to submit your questions. And you would be part of the pipeline. And as soon as the time comes, then your question will be on this live session here, and might end up on the recording on YouTube, right? The good ones. All right, cool. Thanks for the questions. Thanks for joining here today. And thanks for sticking around, even though we didn't discuss initially a lot of data vault, but this is really not just data vault. It's really about also information delivery. What do we do out of this data vault, right? So not just, the enterprise is not just data vault. All right, the enterprise data vault, it's not just data vault. Cool. Thanks for joining. Have a nice weekend. See you next Friday, guys. Thank you, guys. Thanks for joining today. If you'd like to discuss this further, give us a call on the number below here, and we're happy to discuss this with you. See you next time. Have a nice weekend. Bye-bye.